One day, before the story began, on a dark, rainy evening, a young girl was in a terrible accident that took her life. This was the heroine's past life, in which she was just a graduating student and only endlessly groveled before her professors, and therefore such a death seemed an even more unfair turn of fate. However, later, the girl returned to life, but not to the usual one, because she found herself in the world of a stupid novel that she had read the day before. She was reborn in the body of a villainess who, according to the original plot, would have suffered a horrible death at the end of the story. In the book, the girl's actions led to the fact that almost everyone around her wanted, and were even ready to take her life without much regret. If she had left everything as it was and had not tried to change her fate, the two main characters of the novel would have simply killed her. The blue-eyed girl was torn away from these thoughts much later, during a deeply intimate moment when she was called out. She was taking a hot bath in the arms of one of the fair-haired heroes, and she couldn't understand what burned more, the water or his touch. He brushed the hair from her face, noting the change in mood, and asking the girl not to say that she was thinking about that bastard, Callus Hannett, again. Feeling his touch, she blushed brightly and closed her eyes, quietly calling the man's name. Rush gently stroked her back with his broad palms and pressed her closer to his body, while she assured him that this was completely impossible. Pressing her forehead against his and feeling familiar hands on her hips, the girl gently reminded him that she was only his wife. Listening to his voice as he softly whispered words of comfort into her ear, Syria thought about how strange it was that the person she possessed had to be the worst villain. Rush smiled, advising her to stay close to him and reminding her that only one man could make her an archduchess. Looking into his bright red eyes, and no longer struggling with the embarrassment that was overwhelming her, the girl touched his nose with hers when the man said that this person was him. The other main character was also not indifferent to the girl and stood on his knees, bowing his head and pleadingly addressing her by name. Callus asked desperately what he could do, but Syria only muttered his name in confusion, looking at the man. He looked up at the girl, his wheat-colored hair glinting in the moonlight as he asked again what he could do to bring her back. Suddenly, grabbing the blue-eyed girl by the hand, he pressed his cheek to the back of her hand, saying that he would do anything as soon as the girl said so. Next came a vision of a yellow-eyed girl with warm chestnut hair and a short haircut, saying that she wanted to see Syria change into a wedding dress. The blue-eyed girl smiled nervously and asked again what she meant, but she herself thought that the girl's desire was strange. Later, the yellow-eyed one asked about Syria's mother, who was a commoner but became an artist. At such moments, Syria realized that even the main character of the novel, around whom the main events were supposed to revolve, had changed and behaved completely differently than in the book. Blue-eyed could only think fearfully and feverishly about whether she would be able to survive in this strange and changing story. In Syria's mind, a silhouette of a woman appeared, covered in a long white scarf, the train of which reached the floor, although it seemed that she was standing in water. She asked the confused girl if she wanted to fight and survive, and she just opened her eyes wide. Stepping closer, the stranger said that if the answer was positive, Syria would have to think carefully about everything. She should have thought carefully about her desires and plans, and what they might lead to in the future. In the vision, she saw herself in a beautiful wedding dress, but not at the altar, but on the floor, slowly covered in her own blood. Rush ran towards her as fast as he could, calling her name when he saw what had happened to the girl. Blue-eyed saw him, but being exhausted, she closed her eyes, covered with a veil of tears, and lost consciousness, unable to hold on any longer. And now, finally, at the beginning of the story, a girl with cold green hair sat on the terrace and drank tea with an interlocutor who said that a bright future awaited the empire. The blonde watched a couple of young people walking in the yard and then said that if a saint had descended from heaven, they were blessed from above. When one of the main characters pulled off his coat and covered the girl with brown hair with it, the interlocutor asked if Syria's fiancé was being too close to her. She noted with a slight smile that they seemed to have become very close, and now would be the time to be jealous. Clenching her hand, which already had an engagement ring, into a fist, the girl gritted her teeth, mentally calling Callus a scoundrel, because there was only a week left until their wedding. The blue-eyed girl thought that now she would gladly go out into the street and pull out all of her fiancé's hair, but around prying eyes she would have to restrain this impulse, and so she quietly laughed, saying that he was simply very sociable. Syria started coughing, and the girl who was a doctor stepped towards her and asked if the miss had not yet recovered from her cold, adding that she would prepare some medicine for her in the evening. Their chaotic conversation was interrupted by the Archduke of the Empire, Girux Rush Burke, who always looked impeccable and a little menacing, confirming his reputation as a strict master. He told Syria that if she remained on the terrace, her condition would worsen, and the importunate suitor would consider it his duty to make a scene and send for the high priest. And the girl bowed her head, asking forgiveness from his lordship. Having already turned around and was walking towards the exit, Rush added that the saint would soon be escorted to the Supreme Church, since he was not going to tolerate any more scandals in his home. Looking after him, the blue-eyed girl thought that now he seemed cold and unfriendly. But in the original story, everything would go wrong later. He will fall in love with the main character, a saint, at the end of the story, according to his plotline. They were all characters in a romance novel about a dimension-hopping heroine named Lena. She ended up in another world, where, as time passed, two main characters began to show love for her. Blue Eyes became Syria Stern, a villain who didn't have the best fate at the end of the story. Syria inherited the power of the gods and was able to obtain the title of Sterna, and perhaps would have become the holiest being in the universe, but something got in the way. The heroine's bad temper pushed her to meanness in the original, and almost everyone considered her a walking problem for the entire high society. She was only interested in extravagance, in which she was very successful, but her relations with her family became extremely disgusting. After the migration of an ordinary student into the body and life of this girl, the only thought that was pounding in her head was how to somehow miraculously stay alive. Remembering the accident, she thought that she had already lost her life before her time, so she definitely did not plan to die in this universe. Before the main character, Lena, appeared, she had to come up with a way to get rid of all the enemies that the real Syria had managed to make. She began to bow her head and ask for forgiveness from everyone she might have harmed or simply been rude to, without being ashamed of how it would look. In an attempt to change her reputation, the girl stopped spending huge sums on herself and began giving gifts to everyone she could. Soon, Syria came to Callus, who had injured his arm, and said that she would heal him, and when asked about rare herbs, she simply replied that she had collected them on the rocks behind the church. The young man asked in surprise if she had really dared to go to these rocks alone, and she, without hesitation, simply answered with consent. In the original story, Callus was one of those who killed Syria, and so the girl wanted to please him and earn his trust, deciding to help with the hand. Then, by pure chance, they felt an unsettling mutual attraction to each other. The young man sat up in bed, burying his healthy hand in her wheat-colored hair, and asked the girl to tell him honestly what had made her change so much. Callus gradually began to spend more and more time with the blue-eyed girl, inviting her on walks and various events. Their time spent together became more and more romantic and could no longer pass for ordinary friendly sympathy because he fell in love. After a short time, he got down on one knee in front of the girl, opened the box with the engagement ring, and asked why they didn't get married. In the original story, the protagonist and heroine fall in love with each other, and Callus commits suicide, and Syria thought that this development would be beneficial for both of them, agreeing to this marriage. Watching Rush walk away and returning to the present, the blue-eyed girl thought that this was the perfect change in the plot. Looking back and sitting down at the table on the terrace again, she looked at Lena and Callus, wondering if their love would have worked out if there weren't some obstacles. A few days later, the saint came to Syria's chambers, loudly and enthusiastically calling the young man's bride. Lena told the surprised and silent blue-eyed girl that she was very glad to meet her and introduced herself by her name. Giving in to impulse, the brunette grabbed her interlocutor's hand with both hands, shouting that she had dreamed of seeing her and chatting. Syria tried to pass off a nervous smile as normal and closed her eyes, not understanding what was happening, because she did not want to have anything to do with the girl. Putting her palms together, Lena introduced herself again and said that she felt a little uncomfortable with the title of saint for coming from another world, and the blue-eyed girl replied that she knew about it. The brunette looked back and said that she had heard that the girl would be trying on a wedding dress today, and, having received consent, asked how it was. Lena cried out excitedly that a wedding dress from a world unknown to her must be stunning, because everyone here was wearing magnificent dresses, and she was burning with curiosity. Barely listening to her, Syria wondered why the saint was calling Callus by name, when it had taken her 11 months to allow herself to do so. When the brunette called her by name, the blue-eyed girl, hiding her irritation, responded and smiled, asking what was the matter. Without further ado, Lena said that she wanted to see the girl change into a wedding dress. To save the day, Syria's dressmaker, Begonia, a blonde with green eyes, clutched a book of sketches to her and said that trying on a wedding dress was not a performance at all. As she passed the saint, she added that the privilege of attending fittings was limited to the bride's guests, close relatives, and best friends. Without really caring about Lena's feelings, Begonia casually said that the girl did not belong to any of the above types. The brunette nervously asked for forgiveness, saying that she still had not gotten used to the customs of the new world. Syria recalled that in the original story, Begonia was also a villain, who was later fired by Callus for her cruel treatment of Saint Lena. Bowing to the blue-eyed girl, the girl muttered with tears in her eyes that, in that case, they would see each other later. As she left, the girl thought excitedly about what the hell was going on and why the moment that was in the book had happened. Later that evening, Syria sat in Callus's office and asked why she suddenly had to change her dressmaker. The young man replied that she herself should understand the whole situation if she was present there. He said that Saint Lena was sent to them by heaven, and therefore she was, of course, completely different from the vicious aristocrats. The fair-haired man added that if the dressmaker was unable to understand this, then it would be better to fire her. And Syria silently and fearfully thought about the fact that history simply had to change. But for some reason, events repeated themselves. She steadfastly explained that Begonia had only told the saint not to look at the bride while she was changing clothes, since by aristocratic standards she was behaving impolitely. Callus was about to object, and the blue-eyed girl froze, meeting his gaze when he called the brunette simply by her first name. Syria looked at him with distrust and anger, which she could hardly hide at the moment when emotions overwhelmed her. The young man himself covered his mouth with his hand when the girl asked again whether he had really called the saint by her name in the presence of his fiancée. Scratching his chin, the fair-haired man said that he admitted his mistake and asked for forgiveness, but his attitude towards the dressmaker was due to the fact that he was appointed the saint's protector. Exhaling loudly through her nose, Serta thought without any enthusiasm that even this event in the book was reflected in her current reality. In the original, Lena's divine power became extremely unstable after she was brought to their world, and the powers that be decided to choose a protector. They found him among the heads of the 17 houses that possessed the power of God, and the choice fell on the head of the house of Hanat Callus. In such circumstances, their rapprochement was quite natural, but Syria hoped that this would not happen, because she and the young man were engaged and preparing for the wedding. Noticing the girl's thoughtfulness, the fair-haired man stood up and stepped towards her, asking if she was worried that he had forgotten to tell her about his appointment as protector. Looking at his face, the blue-eyed girl thought that she couldn't get angry at him now and push him even further away from herself. Deciding that her life was much more important to her than her pride at the moment, Syria raised her head, smiled, and simply told her fiancé that she understood him. A smile spread across the young man's face, and he exhaled loudly, noting that it was a great relief. Hanging over the girl and leaning against the back of the sofa on either side of her head, Callus said that he was afraid of the bride's possible offense. Leaning towards the girl's face, the fair-haired man smiled brightly and thanked his love for the understanding shown to him in the current situation. The next day, walking through the snowy forest, Syria, her cheeks burning from the cold, remembered what her fiancé had called her yesterday. As she strode forward, she felt the icy air burning her lungs and thought angrily that such a love should be sent to hell. Today, he apologized to his fiancée again, saying that Lena's divine power seemed to have gotten out of control again, and so he had to visit her immediately, and Syria could only think about it angrily. Stopping by the lake, the blue-eyed girl hugged herself by the shoulders, thinking about how difficult it was to be a good person, and, it seemed, beginning to understand the path of a real heroine, whose place had now fallen to her. Suddenly, the commander of the Knights of House Burke, Elliot, called out to her and said that he had heard about her cold, and now, while checking the glacier, she must be even more tired than before. On the property of the House of Burke was an unusual accumulation of ice, which was known to all locals as the Tomb of Monsters. The dukes were tasked with periodically checking the barrier around it to prevent the likely appearance of monsters, and this required the power of the gods, which they had given to Stern. In the original story, the heroine always postponed going to the lake, responding to the servants' reminders that she had no interest in this ritual. Now that the blue-eyed one had decided to strengthen her position and survive here, she had to firmly fulfill all her duties, including this one. Exhaling a cloud of steam, Sir Elliot asked if they had spent enough time on the inspection and suggested that the girl return to the castle. Blue-eyed asked if he was sure that was the case, but they were suddenly distracted from their conversation by Rush's voice, which seemed to appear out of nowhere. Syria turned around in surprise and a little confusion when the man asked what he was doing here now. The Archduke stepped straight towards them, and Elliot lowered his head in greeting to His Majesty. The girl looked at the fair-haired man in surprise when he muttered something irritably. Blue-Eyed realized that she had been silent for too long when Rush stepped a little closer and addressed her again in a cool voice. He looked her over from head to toe with an attentive gaze of bright red eyes, and then asked if she heard his question. Elliot stood next to them and didn't know whether he should take part in the conversation, because the Archduke was one of the most famous aristocrats, known for his strictness. When Syria asked in confusion what she had done wrong, Rush asked why she had come to the lake in such weather, although she had not yet recovered from her cold. The girl thanked him for his concern and said that she was already feeling better and that coming here was her duty as stern. The man lowered his head, not taking his eyes off the blue-eyed woman's face, and asked since when had she started taking her duties seriously. Rush put his hands on his hips and casually asked if she was trying to get even sicker to attract her fiancé's attention. Thinking it was worth trying to break the awkward conversation, Elliot raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture, calling his lordship, but he didn't even bat an eyelash. Placing her palm on her chest, Syria said that she had no other personal reason for coming here other than the desire to fulfill her duty. Rush pursed his lips, a little surprised but not showing it, when the girl said that no matter how sick she was, her fiancé would not cause a panic in the palace. The Archduke asked if it was a holy matter, and when the blue-eyed girl asked him again what he meant, he directly suggested that there was a love affair between Callus and Lena, and Syria felt her heart sink. She lowered her head and turned away from the man, not understanding how he could even ask her such questions. Mentally cursing at himself, Rush exhaled and asked if they were finished with their check yet. Elliot readily answered the question in the affirmative, admiringly noting that, thanks to Miss Syria's work, they had finished very quickly. The girl blushed slightly when the head of the knights praised her, but she couldn't contain her anger at the words she had recently heard. Looking at Rush from under her brows, she mentally asked who he thought he was, and why he was even talking to her with such arrogance and willfulness. Syria thought it was because the Archduke was a protagonist who was not at all unattractive, but she didn't understand why he had to be made so nasty. He turned around so quickly that the blue-eyed girl barely had time to avert her attentive gaze and quickly turned away. Exhaling heavily and blushing, the girl thought about how close they had been to locking eyes, and then suddenly felt a weight on her shoulders. Rush covered her with his warm woolen cape, wrapped on the outside with elegant patterns on red fabric and covered with thick sable fur on top, saying that he could not allow the health of their precious Serna to deteriorate. Looking after him in surprise, Syria pulled her cape tighter around her and blushed, not understanding why he had suddenly become kinder after all his caustic remarks. The next day, walking through the snowy garden and thinking about what had happened, the blue-eyed girl suggested that maybe he liked her more than she thought. Pressing her palm to her lips, she decided that it was still better to avoid Rush, because there was something scary about him, and his manner of speaking did not need any introduction at all. Imagining the formidable Archduke, the girl thought that she just wanted to get married and leave this place as soon as possible. She had to stay at the Burke house because the Sterns were considered saints in the Empire and were allowed to take part in important rites and even wedding vows, but one of them was to control the glacier that protected the frozen lake. Sitting down, Syria hugged herself with her arms, mentally calling the book stupid and thinking about how she wanted to avoid holding the wedding here at all costs. She mainly wanted this because at the end of the novel, the two main characters, Lena and Rush, were supposed to get married. Moreover, as the plot progressed, it would gradually turn out that the saint who came from another world was also Sterna. Looking at her hands, the blue-eyed girl thought that this fate was too tricky even for the main character and understood why the real Syria envied her. The girl stood up and sighed, mentally reminding herself that the nature of the saint would only become known at the end of the novel, and therefore it would be nice if she quietly got married and moved out of here now. Suddenly her name was called, and the blue-eyed girl turned around to see in front of her the short-haired Abigail Orion, her accompanying knight. Taking her friend by the hands, Syria began to bombard her with questions about how the expedition to the monsters went, whether everyone returned safe, and the dark-haired girl, with a smile, asked her not to forget to breathe. Lowering her voice to a whisper, the blue-eyed girl asked Ebby if she had killed anyone, since she was a former mercenary, and the knight laughed, reminding her that she specialized exclusively in bandits. The girl said that everything went well, but she lacked her friend's help, and her armor became cold as ice. Thoughtfully looking down, Syria bit the inside of her cheek, thinking about how she knew she should have gone. One of the main reasons the world needed the Sterns was because the gear used constellation steel, but without the aid of the star armor, the heat would begin to drain from the body when in prolonged contact. Adjusting her cloak and wrapping it tighter around her mistress's neck, Ebby said that they needed to hurry up and get inside, because the cold could make them catch a cold. At these words, Syria remembered Rush when he said that he could not allow the health of precious Sterna to deteriorate. She blushed, remembering his cape over his shoulders, and thought that this was the first time that the rude man had behaved so caringly, and now she was at least a precious Sterna. Having decided to mentally strengthen her belief in her usefulness, the girl smiled and called Ebby to follow her, asking him to tell her about everything that happened on the expedition. The girls were talking to each other and couldn't even imagine that they were being watched from the castle window. Saint Lena watched this conversation with interest, her shining yellow eyes wide open. The man in the room with her suddenly said that Miss Syria had changed a lot in the last year when she became close to Marcus Hannett. Turning away from the window, the brunette asked with interest why Callus's fiancé went to the glacier every day. Her interlocutor replied that she was doing this because of her stern nature, since only they could clear the magical barrier of the frozen lake. Lena turned back to the window, looking at the smiling Sharia, as the man said that she had recently received a reward from the palace for diligently fulfilling her duties. The saint, without taking her eyes off the girl with cold green hair, whispered that she envied her, and her interlocutor asked again what she meant. Lena suddenly asked if she could receive the title of Sterna, and the man, a little lost, replied that everyone around her already considered her a saint. Folding her arms across her chest, the brunette said that it was cooler to be Sterna, because only her magic could clear the barrier, so everyone in the palace was interested in it, and her divine power was not capable of it. The man simply replied that a lavish reception in honor of the saint would soon be held at the palace, but that she, of course, needed to learn all the proper rules of etiquette. He added that not everyone can become stern, and what were the reasons for that? But the girl no longer listened. She turned back to the window, looking at the blue-eyed girl and her strange companion, and then quietly repeated that she envied Syria. In the evening, Sterna spent time in her chambers with her personal physician, who reminded her that her birthday was coming up soon. Handing Syria a teaspoon with some liquid, she said that it was medicine for a cold. The girl smiled softly, saying that she had completely forgotten about the birthday because she had been too busy with her duties and affairs. To obtain the status of Sterna, a person had to meet a couple of conditions. A child born on Monday had a beautiful appearance, and one born on Tuesday was full of divine mercy. The Wednesday child was filled with sadness, the Thursday child was filled with love, and the Friday child treated others with kindness and courtesy. It seemed like this whole list was unfair to Wednesday-born children like Syria. At least in the original story, the girl found these lines from the church song unfair, but soon came to love her birthday. She was granted the title at the age of 15, when the awakening of her spiritual powers was marked by the appearance of a small star on her neck, and she immediately renounced her family name of Keladin, proudly using the name of her title instead. She closed her eyes, thinking about all this, and the doctor, noticing this, quietly called out to her. The woman suddenly said that Saint Lena was still interested in the constellation stele, and Syria looked at her in surprise. Blue Eyes asked if it was dangerous for her to approach the statue when her strength had not yet stabilized, and the woman complained that she had a very inquisitive nature. Syria thought that curiosity was exactly what the main character was supposed to be, but in the original, she became stern when she touched the constellation. Clutching the fabric of her dress skirt in her hands, she closed her eyes and exhaled, thinking that she would try not to worry about it too much. Blue-Eyed reassured herself that after the wedding, she would leave and live peacefully in the Hannett's house until this whole story came to an end. The next day, Syria ran into Rush again and was surprised to see that they continued to bump into each other without stopping. A few minutes ago, in the Green Garden storage, a girl was looking at the silver laurel branches, thinking that she would never cease to be amazed by them. While folding the twigs, the blue-eyed girl thought with pleasure that if Sterna could become a plant, she would certainly become one. Without this silver laurel, in whose branches was the power to purify, it was impossible to check the glacier. Clutching the collected laurel branches to herself, the girl prepared to leave, smiling as she thought that she could have invited Ebby to come with her today. Syria suddenly crashed into someone due to her carelessness, hitting her head on something quite strong. Standing in front of her, Rush noticed that the girl was in a good mood today, and she smiled in surprise, looking up and greeting his lordship. Immediately realizing her mistake, the blue-eyed one immediately bowed and asked for forgiveness and bowed, dropping some of the branches she had collected. Laughing nervously and blushing, she went down and said that everything had fallen apart. Syria froze in surprise as Rush crouched down behind her and reached out to gather the twigs. Holding one to his chest and lifting the next one, the man asked if she was heading to the lake again today. The girl, who was extremely surprised and even blushed a little from the Archduke's actions, did not answer at first. But when he called out to her, she immediately raised her head and agreed. Looking at her face, the blonde man suddenly said that he couldn't understand something, and Syria bit her lip, asking what exactly. Rush said that, as far as he knew, she was constantly being cared for in her quarters, and then asked if that wasn't enough for her. The blue-eyed girl looked at him in surprise, because such a question took her by surprise, and she didn't really understand what he was getting at. He stood up and said that she didn't need to check the glacier so often, and then asked if she had tried last time because she needed something. Striking the girl with embarrassment and shame for her past behavior, the man casually mentioned that she always screamed if she didn't like something. Finishing her off, Rush reminded her that after serving her, about 100 servants were bedridden. Mentally cursing the real series, the blue-eyed girl desperately declared that it was because of this that she had to try harder and compensate all the people for the damage caused. Suddenly smiling warmly, Rush called the girl mysterious and said that he would even be a little sorry when she left for the Hannett house. When he carefully handed her all the laurel leaves, the blue-eyed girl froze, as if struck by lightning, not believing that she had heard such words from him. Looking up and pressing the branches to herself, she remained silent, but seemed absolutely certain that the Archduke could hear the noisy beating of her heart. She continued to think about it again and again, even when she was already in her chambers and calmly drinking hot tea. The maids, who had interrupted her thoughts, filled the table with various boxes and informed the miss that wedding presents addressed to her had arrived. One of the girls said that the Marquis of Hannett personally sent the sapphire to the bride, and then admired its purity and richness of color. Ignoring all these words, Syria looked at her reflection in the cup of tea, once again playing Rush's words over in her head. Such a statement from the main character gave her some guarantees that she would be able to cope, and it seemed that now the distance had become kilometers. The girl turned around as the maid handed her a box and said that she had prepared for her the bracelet that the miss had spoken of. Taking out the bracelet, the blue-eyed girl thought with a smile that Callus had given her so much that she could repay him by giving him a nice gift before the ceremony. One of the maids asked if Syria was going to give it to the Marquis, and another, unable to contain her emotions, said that it was very romantic. Closing the box again and hiding the glowing blue crystal, the girl thought about how in the original, Lena found a mine with them. She thought with a smile that until that happened, they would be considered just precious stones, and therefore she was sure that Callus would appreciate the gift. Her peace was interrupted by her personal physician, who burst into the chambers, calling the girl and shouting that a disaster had occurred. Both Syria and her maids turned to the door in surprise, awaiting further explanations and actions from the woman. She shouted that Saint Lena had fainted after touching the Constellation Steel monument. Syria swallowed quietly as the woman added that the very monument, among other things, had become transparent and glowed. Imagining what had happened to Lena, the blue-eyed girl began to breathe heavily and realized that this was a sign of the appearance of a new stern. She walked towards the saint's chambers, feeling that her legs had become like cotton wool, and her head was heavy. Blood pounded in her temples from excitement and fear, from worry. Callus was already sitting by Lena's unconscious bed, tightly squeezing her hand with both hands and looking overly agitated. Walking towards them, Syria mentally panicked, thinking that they were still at the very beginning of history, and the brown-haired girl's formation as Cerna should have happened much later. Rush entered the chambers and asked how the saint was feeling, and the servants, priests and doctors bowed, greeting the Archduke. One young man replied that the worst was fortunately over, and they were all very lucky that the Marquis of Hannett was there. Syria felt a twinge of jealousy and anger when she realized that her fiancé hadn't even noticed her arrival, but was still directing all his attention to Lena. Rush looked at the blue-eyed girl, who stood with her back to him, while the servant told him that a new sterna had appeared today. The Archduke remained silent, even when the youth said that Saint Lena would repay him for the kindness he had shown her. As they walked into the corridor, he folded his arms across his chest and asked Syria if she had suffered the same when she woke up, and the girl denied it, as she was not that strong, and the power of the constellation steel that affects a person is proportional to his own. Rush immediately turned darker than a cloud and asked if this meant that the saint, who couldn't help but know that her body was filled with divine power, had deliberately touched the steel, causing a ruckus in his palace. One of the doctors suggested that Lena probably had no idea about her power, so she touched the monument without thinking, and since her divine power was unstable, the accident happened. Turning to the long-haired man, the Archduke asked if he had given her lessons, and when he agreed, He asked why the saint could do such a thing. He hesitated a little, but replied that it could have happened because Lena admired Miss Syria, and the blue-eyed girl looked at him in surprise. The servant bowed and asked Rush for forgiveness, saying that it was entirely his fault, but he calmly replied that at least he knew something. Silent Syria wondered if Lena had touched the steel because she admired it, or simply wanted to test whether she could become stern. In the book, all this happened completely by accident, and the brunette's divine power flared up so powerfully that it almost killed her. The girl was torn from her thoughts by the loud voice of Rush's assistant, who was running forward and calling His Majesty. A blond man with glasses and purple eyes, Lenin, pressed his hand to his chest and said that Saint Lena had regained consciousness. The Archduke replied indifferently that it was fine and that they could go now, but the assistant stopped him and said that it would be nice to have a look. Rush turned to him and, glaring at him with an angry look from his bright red eyes, asked if he looked like a nurse. Clasping his hands together in a pleading gesture, Lenin said they needed to do this if only to maintain good relations with the high priest. Turning around, the fair-haired man suggested that Miss Syria visit the saint together, since she had become a stern, like the girl, and she exhaled loudly. Seeing the brunette's wide eyes, Marquis Hannay rushed towards her and shouted the girl's name, and the trembling was evident even in his voice. Lena, who had looked at him weakly, was coming to her senses, sweating from the heat that had taken over her body. Stepping back towards her bed and taking her hand, he asked excitedly how she was feeling, and she quietly called his name. When Rush and Syria were already next to them, Lena said that she was in pain, and Callus replied that everything would be fine with her because he was nearby, and the young people called each other simply by their first names. Ibi stepped towards her mistress and leaned towards her ear, asking if she should cut off the Marquis's hand. Rush let out an irritated breath as he looked around at the scene and turned away from the couple who were feeling quite comfortable. He waved his hand towards the bed and said that he no longer intended to keep this burden in his palace. Syria turned to him in surprise when she heard these words, but she could hardly lie that they did not warm her soul. The Archduke ordered Lenin to write to the High Church that Saint Lena could return there as soon as she could walk, and he bowed to his master. Having risen, Callus sharply shouted that this was too much, because Lena did not plan to get sick, and even more so, one cannot call a sick person a burden. Without hiding his mockery of the Marquis, Rush rightly asked whether he really couldn't express himself in his own home as he saw fit. Callus said that these words were still too harsh, because the girl was not disabled, she was simply ill. The man replied that the Marquis had said that word at just the right time, since his relationship with his bride also could not be called healthy, and Syria froze. Rush asked if he thought his priorities were a little off, adding that people might think his fiancée was a saint, and Callus turned around. The girl pressed her lips together, thinking that she was about to burst into tears from resentment and a burning feeling of shame when the groom finally looked at her. She thought about how, worrying about her safety and preserving her life, she never showed anger and endured everything steadfastly, but this went beyond the bounds. Rush put his hands on his hips, declaring that they hadn't held Sterna's wedding in a long time, and therefore the vow he had given to her should be kept like a sacred thing. Syria clasped her hands and lowered her head, feeling an unpleasant tremor throughout her body and thinking about how humiliating it all was. She thought that she wanted to go home, that she wanted to live in peace, and then Callus and Lena suddenly put on such a show, and she became darker than a cloud. Suddenly, the blue-eyed girl saw a hand extended to her, clad in a white glove, and then a man's voice called her. Sterna looked at the Archduke, who seemed to protect her from the unpleasant situation that was happening with just his soft voice. Rush, completely ignoring the Marquis and the saint, looked at her and said that they should leave here. The man said that the saint needed rest, hurrying Syria, and she blushed a little, but felt that at the moment he was her only salvation. Seeing this, the Marquis raised his gaze and hand, calling his bride by name, but this only pushed her further towards a more correct decision. Lena immediately started coughing and called Callus by name again, and he rushed to her, forgetting about everything and asking if she was okay. Irritated by the Marquis's behavior, Rush took her hand himself, grasping her fragile fingers with his wide palm. He gently lifted her palm, moving the girl a little closer to him, and asked if they could leave this place. Turning away from the groom and the already rather annoying Lena, Syria agreed with His Majesty and followed him to the exit. The next day, the girl was in the vault as usual, collecting branches, thinking about the previous day and everything that had happened. She couldn't get the image of a caring Callus out of her head, promising the saint to be there for her and telling her she would be okay. Syria closed her eyes and thought with irritation that the scoundrel had not said a word to her since then, let alone apologize. Suddenly Rush called her, looking thoughtful, but no more than usual, and seemed to be worried about something. She involuntarily blushed, remembering his silent but very telling in its actions representation yesterday, and lowered her gaze, thinking that she had not even thanked him. The girl was about to begin, but his lordship interrupted her, asking if she could check the barber properly after what had happened. The Archduke suddenly said that if she needed work as an excuse, why not move into the annex? Blue-eyed froze when she heard his words and hugged the bundle of branches to herself, not knowing how to react. Recovering herself, she told him that he need not worry, as she must carry out her duties as carefully as always. Syria tried to make her smile as genuine as possible and said she would never neglect her duty as a stern. Rush wanted to explain that he didn't mean that at all, but the girl was suddenly called out by the Marquis's familiar voice. He opened the wooden door of the vault and said that he had been wondering where to find the bride, but she was here. Turning to him, the Archduke pointed out the discourtesy to Callus, asking if he had not noticed it. The young man asked for forgiveness for his rudeness and explained it by the fact that he could not find his bride anywhere, although he had been looking for her all day. Syria froze in surprise when the Marquis suddenly said that he didn't expect to see the two of them together in such a secluded room. He called for the blue-eyed girl to follow him, but Rush easily noticed her reluctance and discomfort and therefore decided to intervene. The Archduke, his face immediately changing, sternly told his lord that he had not given him permission to enter this vault. As if shielding the girl with himself, he moved forward a little and asked Callus if he really didn't know that no one except Sterna could enter the walls of this place without his personal permission. The Marquis stretched out his arms and said with a smile that he would gladly repay the debt when he returned to his native lands. He presumptuously and even brazenly asked Rush to say if he had already chosen the amount and to announce it. Stepping forward with an angry expression, the Archduke declared that Callus had no right to choose his own punishment and that it would be meted out according to the traditions of House Burke. He raised his hand, clad in a black glove, and said that the Marquis would have one of the chosen hands cut off at the wrist. The man asked him what he thought about it, and the Marquis replied with a smile that he did not know how much the Archduke needed his hand. The young man asked Rush if he wanted to start a war between the two houses, and he replied that it was Callus himself who was asking for it. Syria thought excitedly that it was very stupid to start a war in winter to find out who was braver, although, with such a passionate thirst for battle, they certainly would not die. Rush said that if Callus was seeking war, House Burke would gladly answer the challenge, but he replied that only the Archduke wished for such a clash. The man, with a calm and cold expression on his face, said that in that case, he would immediately order an urgent telegram to be sent, and the blue-eyed girl opened her eyes wide in fear. Deciding it was time to act, Syria gently tugged at Rush's cloak and told him that her fiancé had shown disrespect, but there was no need to start a war over a trifle, as it would be cruel to the knights, who were already busy tending to the glacier. She tried to make her voice as touching and gentle as possible as she asked him again. The man looked at the thin, fragile fingers clutching his cloak as Syria begged for his favor. Letting go of the fabric, the blue-eyed girl immediately bowed her head, saying that she was already familiar with his mercy, because he showed it to her too. The Marquis stared at them in anger and surprise when the girl assured the Archduke that her fiancé would never do anything so disrespectful again. Turning to Hannet, the man said that he had the most beautiful bride, and then, without saying goodbye, proceeded to the exit of the vault. With childish spontaneity, waving her fist, the blue-eyed girl happily thought that trouble had passed them by. Callus, looking more serious than ever, distracted the girl with his words that they needed to talk. Already on the street, the Marquis tried to shout to the bride while she was quickly walking forward along the snowy paths, and asked how the girl could behave like that, because it was very immodest of her to grab the Archduke by the clothes. Blue Eyes flinched and stopped, feeling a surge of anger when her fiancé stated that her disgusting and rude behavior was caused by anger. Turning around after that, Syria asked sharply if he really wanted to call only her behavior rude. The young man threw up his hands and asked her to calm down, because Lena was sick. The gods had sent her from another world, and she had no one else to rely on except Hannet. He grabbed his bride's wrist sharply with his strong hand and cried out, asking if she could understand at least this. Blue-eyed replied that she understood, but Marquis continued to question her, asking why she was acting like that and was angry, spending time with another man and not even looking him in the eyes. The girl said that the groom behaved the same way with the saint, but he again shouted that these were completely different things, because Lena was sick, and Syria suddenly agreed that everything was really different. Raising an angry and devoted gaze, she said steadfastly and coldly that at least she did not call the Archduke by name in front of Callus. The blue-eyed girl demanded to let her go, but the young man again asked her to listen, preparing for more excuses. She thought she had heard enough and jerked her hand away, jerking forward and mentally calling her fiancé an idiot when he called out to her in fear. Syria was breathing heavily, feeling a sharp pain, but it was easily drowned out by rage, and so she considered that she was ready to continue the quarrel. Without hiding the tears that had accumulated in the corners of her eyes and leaning her bloody palm against the bark of the tree she had collided with, the blue-eyed girl hissed that she had clearly asked to let her go. Callus rushed towards her and asked if it was possible to pull her hand away so abruptly, adding that she had hit a tree while the girl had clenched her hand into a fist, hiding the wounds. Stunning the groom, she said that in his place, after all that had happened, she would have filed for annulment of their engagement and asked for the hand of the saint. The young man looked at his bride in confusion and asked how she could say such a thing, since she was his only love. Unable to contain her anger, Syria screamed, asking who would believe a man who tenderly held another woman's hand in front of his fiancé. She raised her wet gaze, but rather from simple resentment, because she was not as head over heels in love with Callus as the main character, although she liked him. In the original story, he killed Syria and soon took his own life when he was rejected by St. Lena. Blue Eyes mentally tried to justify her actions by saying that the same fate awaited them both, but since the main characters were destined for a happy ending, then they could also get a little happiness. She found herself again in that body-shattering state of panic fear of death, and so she cried and said that he knew nothing. Syria pressed her hands to her chest as salty tears streamed down her cheeks and said that he couldn't even imagine how scared she was every time she saw them together. Callus held out his hands to her and whispered hoarsely that he had not meant to make her cry or cause her pain. He buried his hand in his hair, muttered a hoarse apology to his bride, and stepped forward, asking her several times to stop shedding bitter tears. The Marquis hugged the girl tightly and admitted that it was his fault for her condition, and Syria froze in surprise, not expecting his strong touch. She buried her nose in the fabric of his clothes when the young man suggested that they go to his estate as soon as their wedding took place. Callus, realizing the consequences of his actions, promised his bride that when the saint recovered, he would never see her again. Gently taking the fragile hands of the blue-eyed girl in his own and moving away, the Marquis swore that in their future, he would always be a faithful husband. The girl mentally hoped that everything would work out if she trusted the young man now, because marrying him was the simplest and most accessible way to avoid death at the moment. She hung her head, struggling with herself, and only quietly asked him to try not to be late for the wedding, and Callus gently replied that she had absolutely no reason to worry. He smiled as if nothing bad had happened between them and assured his bride that he would never do such a thing, and Syria exhaled because she even wanted to believe him. Later, the young man discussed this issue in St. Lena's chambers, explaining to her all the details and nuances of the current situation. The brunette listened to Hanet's words in surprise, and then asked again, in confusion, how he could say such a thing and what it all meant. Callus, exhaling and lowering his head, said that today was the last day they could call each other by their first names. Standing in front of him, Lena was clearly unwilling to accept the new circumstances that she did not like at all, and asked if it was related to his fiancé. Answering her own question right away, the girl said that, to tell the truth, Viscount Ison had already explained everything to her himself, and henceforth they would have to call each other Marquis Hanet and St. Lena. The blonde man looked away and said that everything was correct, and then added that after his wedding, they would be able to see each other with great difficulty. Looking at the floor, the brunette stubbornly said that this was wrong, because he had become her dear friend. She asked if they could meet sometimes, but Callus interrupted her by calling her name, and the girl looked up. When the young man extended his hand to her, Lena saw an unfamiliar crystal decoration on his wrist and said that she had never seen this bracelet before. Adjusting the chain, the Marquis said that she was quite observant and attentive, and added that the jewel was a gift from Syria. Folding her arms across her chest, the brunette, calling the young man's bride by name, said that she wished them all the best and would even like to be friends. Callus gently reminded her that etiquette required calling someone you weren't close to by their last name, not just their first name. His words seemed to make the girl lose her temper, and she stamped her foot angrily, shouting that it was etiquette again, repeating the word with hatred several times. Lena raised her hands and asked if he realized how much she had to limit herself, and Hanet was a little taken aback by such a strong reaction. Already beginning to cry, the brunette clenched her hands into fists and said that Archduke Burke ordered her to return to the high church, and that this was very scary for her, and it was also sad to lose such a dear friend as the Marquis. The girl sobbed, asking if he could imagine how much and how quickly her world was changing now. Callus listened in confusion as Lena asked if all his words about caring were lies, even though he promised to be her true protector. Falling to her knees and covering her face with her hands, the brunette cried louder and declared that she was very happy when he said all this. The Marquis squatted down in front of her and placed his hand on her thin shoulder, asking for forgiveness so that she would not cry anymore, and he thought that the girl was probably afraid of many things, and she was also ill. He felt that he had to be there at that moment, and sat down next to her on the floor, asking if she had calmed down after a while. Lena called him by name and suddenly said that she wanted to go to the glacier, and Callus asked in surprise why she needed to go there. Raising her head, the brunette said that she was now Sterna and would be able to help Syria with her duties, asking if there was a chance that thanks to this, the relationship between the girls could improve. The Marquis said that he understood her feelings, but in the state the girl was currently in, this was not the best decision. Lena got up from the floor and asked him to stop objecting to her, because she would go there even alone if he was against this idea. Reminding himself that the girl was still a saint, under the protection of House Hanet, Callus exhaled. The young man rose from the floor and agreed to go to the glacier, but only for a short time. When the young people stepped together towards the doors of the chambers, the brunette promised that they would deal with all of this very, very quickly. The next day, a serious snowstorm covered the streets, and the palace, slowly covered with snow, seemed even brighter and even sparkling. As Rush stood at the window in his office, Lennon explained that the Marquis and the Saint had gone off to an unknown location and disappeared, and all contact with them had been cut off, and they had probably been caught in a severe snowstorm. Clenching his fists, turning around and growling that Callus had gone mad, the Archduke asked furiously if this worthless groom really wanted Syria dead. He said that when it comes to Stern's wedding, there is no room for any such misbehavior, because such things cannot be taken so lightly. The man thought that if all the conditions regarding time, place, and other rules were not met, then Sterna's power would flare up, and in the worst case, she herself would die. Folding his arms across his chest and staring into space, Rush thought that the bastard had been well aware of the danger of Sterna's wedding, and yet he had left right before the ceremony. Turning again and staring out the window, the Archduke wondered if he should have punched Callus right then and there and thrown him into the Bastille. His eyes suddenly caught a glimpse of shiny green hair flashing through the crowd, and he noticed Syria with surprise. He asked why Miss was near the search party that was going to look for him, and Lennon explained that she was probably worried about her fiancé and wanted to go with him. Hearing about the girl's excitement, Rush thought that over the past year, she seemed to have become a completely different person, wondering if it was because of love. Muttering that this was amusing, the man turned to his assistant and ordered him to tell Syria that he forbade her to leave the castle. Later, looking out the window in her chambers, the blue-eyed girl could not understand why she could not go out and go with everyone else. Nervous and fearful of what might happen next, the girl clenched her fists and thought in desperation that she had to find Callus before the ceremony began. Suddenly, Ebby came in, her head and shoulders covered in sparkling snow, calling out to her. The knight brushed it all out of her hair and explained that they had been ordered to stop for the day, because the closer they got to the glacier, the more intense the blizzard raged there, but the search would resume at sunrise. Syria clenched her fist and pressed it to her chest, muttering that she understood everything and suggested that her fiancé would never make it back in time. Stepping closer and carefully taking both of her friend's hands in hers, Ebby suddenly announced that Archduke Burke had asked her to convey a message. He saw the knight during his search, immediately remembering that this girl was Syria's personal escort, and therefore he turned to her with this assignment. Repeating exactly the man's words, which she had memorized due to her specific profession, the girl said that he would bring this bastard to the wedding hall. Blue-Eyed seemed to hear Rush's cold, steel-like voice when Ebby said that he would do it, even if he personally had to tie up Callus and throw him there. The Archduke told her that if she did not hear any positive news, even by the day of the ceremony, she should continue to prepare for it as if nothing had happened. Syria even blushed when she heard Rush's words that no matter what happened, the wedding would go as originally planned. Letting go of her friend's hands, Ebby exhaled and muttered that he said all this and was so angry. Turning to the window, Syria said that the High Church constantly emphasized the importance of punctuality, and the Archduke apparently found it very important to carry out all these ceremonies. Ebby asked Miss not to worry, because everyone would join the search, and the girl muttered that she had no doubt that Callus would return because she believed in him. On the day of Sterna's wedding, while they were in the cottage in the middle of a snowstorm, St. Lena screamed that it was too dangerous to go outside. The brunette grabbed the boy's clothes with both hands, desperately screaming that he couldn't just leave her here alone. Callus turned around and said that there was almost no time left before the ceremony, and he needed to get to the palace. Lena's yellow eyes widened, and she asked why they couldn't postpone the whole ceremony for a few days, since he wouldn't be able to get anywhere now anyway. The Marquis lowered his head, sighed, and explained that if it was about Sterna's wedding, then absolutely nothing could be postponed. The young man took her hand, wanting to describe everything in more detail, but it turned out that there was no time left. He suddenly coughed up blood so much that a large drop even landed on the saint's fair cheek. Callus immediately covered his mouth with his hands, and Lena looked at him in fear, her eyes wide open and not really understanding what was happening. Looking at his own blood and swallowing quietly, the Marquis began to say that the wedding ceremony had begun right now. While Syria stood alone at the altar in a white dress, people discussed whether Marquis Hunnet could not return, while others responded that something must have happened, and he could not have simply run away with the saint. The girl held a bouquet of bright red roses in her hands, hearing from all sides how the guests spoke about the disrespect shown to Stern and the possible consequences of such behavior by Callus. The blue-eyed doctor fearfully told her interlocutor that rumors and disrespect were not to be feared, because they could have a much more serious problem. The woman reminded that if things went wrong, Miss Syria's divine power would simply explode. Abigail, hearing this, leaned forward, looking frightened and shocked, and asked the doctor to repeat what he had already said. Here, people suddenly shouted Sterna's name, when the blue-eyed girl suddenly coughed loudly and leaned over, covering her mouth with her hand. Seeing a stain of crimson blood on the floor, the blue-eyed girl covered her mouth with her hand in fear, realizing that it was her own blood, caused by her cough. As the girl fell to her knees, Abigail rushed forward, calling out to her mistress, but the woman next to her grabbed her shoulder, ordering her not to come near her. The knight turned around in surprise when she squeezed her hand, but she explained that it was Sterna's wedding, and therefore if anyone touched her, her divine power would become all-consuming. While everyone around her was panicking and screaming, Syria could only cough and think that she had hoped to avoid the horrible ending, but wondered if it could only happen to her because of the original heroine's nature. The floor turned the horrible scarlet color of death again, and the girl began to cry, afraid of this outcome and wanting it all to end. Sterna's blue eyes filled with tears as she thought about how she only wanted love and couldn't understand what she had done wrong. Suddenly, the wide doors of the ceremonial hall swung open, and the long familiar silhouette of the Archduke appeared in them. The girl looked in his direction, her face wet with tears and blood, while the man confidently and quickly walked towards her, not paying attention to the warnings of those around him. Arriving very quickly, Rush picked her up, allowing her to lean on his strong arms and urged the blue-eyed girl to pull herself together. Looking into Syria's face with his red eyes, he firmly stated that she could not die today, because it would be terribly unfair for her to leave like that. She was beautiful here, at the wedding altar, dressed in a magnificent white dress and covered with the same festive veil. Only she was not standing in the arms of her beloved, but was dying in the arms of another. As if begging for help, the blue-eyed girl desperately squeezed Rush's wrist with her fingers and croaked that she didn't want this. The girl, with tears and coughing, forced out the words that such a death would be too pitiful. The Archduke felt as if his heart had stopped, and then started pounding somewhere in his throat and tried to catch his breath. Syria's palm, which had been squeezing her hand with all its might, fell to the floor with a loud thud, and Rush realized that he no longer had time for thoughts and doubts. He announced to everyone around him that they should prepare for the wedding ceremony, and the priest, surprised, asked his lordship how to understand these words. Looking up, showing the full extent of the peremptory nature of his words, the Archduke declared that this wedding must take place as planned, and Syria Stern would be saved. The girl had a nightmare about running in pitch darkness and begging not to be killed while her pursuer followed her and called her name. She finally opened her eyes, feeling tears rolling down her wet cheeks, and her whole body burning with the horror of the nightmare she had experienced, albeit in an unconscious state. Rush sat in front of her, and he whispered tenderly and excitedly that the girl had woken up. The blue-eyed girl quietly turned to him, but the blonde-haired man reached out to her face and gently wiped away the tears that had accumulated in the corners of her eyes with his finger. He told the girl that she remained beyond his understanding and smiled, asking what dream could bring her to tears before she woke up. Syria asked in surprise if she had really been crying, and the Archduke nodded, then said that otherwise he would not have woken her. The girl quietly asked if he had called her by name, and Rush agreed, repeating the question of what exactly she had dreamed about. Feeling soft medical bandages on her wrists and neck, the blue-eyed woman, without hiding the essence of the nightmare, explained that she felt as if she was dying in it. Wetting a clean towel with water, the man asked if she was so afraid of death, and Syria answered the question with a question, wondering if anyone could not be afraid of her. He gently placed the wet towel on the girl's forehead and chuckled slightly, attracting her surprised attention. Rush said with a smile, as if he thought that Stern clearly wasn't afraid of her after all the antics she had pulled. Blue-eyed looked at him, trying to understand why he was so caring and why she had even managed to survive there, at the altar, left alone. Syria quietly asked how things were with Callus, and the Archduke's face immediately changed, as if changing from mercy to anger, not towards her, but towards the Marquis. He raised his hand and placed it on the towel resting on the girl's forehead, while she looked at him in surprise. Rush suddenly rubbed the blue-eyed girl's forehead with a towel, and when she asked him in confusion what he was doing, he muttered that the girl seemed to have amnesia. Removing his hand, the man asked if Syria really didn't remember what exactly happened at that horrible wedding ceremony. He immediately remembered holding her body, weak and barely weighing anything, in his arms while the priest spoke. Then the head of the Burkes was ordered to take an oath to Syria Stern, the owner of the blessing of the constellation. Hearing all this from him, the girl jumped up on the bed, asking again if they really had become real husband and wife. Rush said that he, as the head of the House of Burke, could not allow his line to be dishonored by the loss of Sterna, and the blue-eyed girl quietly asked if he knew in that case, even before the ceremony, that she could die. The man stood up and agreed, adding that Sterna's wedding had to be done in a strict order, and so, to avoid the worst-case scenario, it was customary not to tell them about it. Surprising Syria and causing her eyes to widen, the Archduke explained that this information was always conveyed to their betrothed, as they too would be in danger if the ceremony was interrupted, as the divine powers would then be released. The girl raised her head, but did not immediately dare to ask this question, and therefore exhaled loudly. Lowering her voice to almost a whisper, the blue-eyed girl asked if he meant to say that Callus knew that she would die if the groom was late. Later that evening, my lord was shouted at to be barred from entering Syria's chambers, but young Hannet opened the doors, calling his now ex-bride by name. The girl, who had been standing by the window and looking at the darkening sky, turned around and gave him the most icy look. The maid screamed in fear that the Archduke had ordered them not to let anyone into the mistress's bedroom, but Syria asked them to leave them because she and the Marquis had something to discuss. When the strangers had left, Callus grabbed her by the shoulders and shouted at the girl, asking how she could do such a thing, how she could marry another, such a scoundrel as Burke. Such words addressed to her current husband and the fear she had experienced did their job, and the blue-eyed girl hit the young man on the cheek with all her might, leaving a bright red mark on it. She coldly and emotionlessly reminded the Marquis that he had never shown up for their wedding ceremony. Syria screamed that if it weren't for Burke, she would have died a completely horrible and painful death, solely due to Callus's fault. The blond man covered his face with his hand, and the girl said that, judging by the expression on his face, he was curious about how she knew this, and then she growled that he understood all the danger he had created for the girl. Feeling a burning anger and a bright resentment, the girl asked with tears in her eyes if this was his ultimate goal, and if that was why he left with the saint at that very moment. The young man lowered his head and called his ex-fiancée by name, muttering hastily that they had simply been caught in a snowstorm on their way. Callus fell to his knees in front of the blue-eyed woman with a thud and looked at his hands, whispering that he had no choice. Raising his hands and gesturing, he shouted that he was terribly worried about the girl, and even during the snowstorm he tried to get to her, but suddenly lost consciousness. The young man burst into tears, looking up and asking Syria to have no doubt that she was the only girl he would ever want to marry. Saying that all his words were spoken from the heart and that he truly loved her, Callus took the girl's hand in his palms, and she felt a strange, unpleasant energy. Syria looked at him in surprise, feeling the already familiar power of light, similar to her own, but not as obvious, and froze. Immediately looking at Hatton's tear-stained face, she wondered why he was still alive, since his powers should have exploded just like hers, as payment for breaking the oath. The Marquis took part in the ceremony at the moment when he swore to marry her, thereby binding himself to all the Sterns as a whole, which meant that, theoretically, any of them could become his wife for the purpose of fulfilling the oath. The blue-eyed girl quietly whispered the name of her former fiancé, as if she had just remembered another, short-haired Stern in these domains. She clenched her free hand into a fist and screamed, "Did he really dare to marry St. Lena?" And the blonde man froze. The girl thought that she would not humiliate herself so much, just to repeat the fate of Saria from the book, and therefore told Callus that she had recently fallen in love with him, but already regretted the wasted time. The blue-eyed girl felt something clench in her chest, because before what happened, she was always careful that her dear fiancé would not be upset. The Marquis cried out that the marriage was only temporary, declaring that it was necessary so that they both could survive. Without hiding the tears of anger, the blue-eyed one loudly declared that it did not matter, thinking that her behavior as a beautiful and submissive bride had only ruined her. The young man stepped forward and said desperately that they could divorce their unloved ones and marry each other, just start over, because there was still time. Callus's eyes widened in surprise, his cheek still stinging from when Syria asked him if it was just a matter of time. Looking at him from under her brows, the girl exhaled, gathered her courage, and coldly said that her feelings for the Marquis had disappeared. She walked down the corridor, not wanting to listen to any more meaningless excuses, but the blonde ran after her, asking her to stop and discuss everything. Callus grabbed her wrist tightly, and the girl turned around, looking irritatedly at her ex-fiancé, who could not understand the doom of their relationship. Wincing, the blue-eyed woman hissed in anger that the Marquis was emanating the power of another, alien Sterna, which she felt. The young man froze when his ex-fiancé spat out in disgust that she was disgusted to feel this energy on her in his touch. The Marquis again asked the girl to stop, but a cold and stern voice interrupted their squabble when the Archduke repeated that the girl had ordered him to let her go. Rush straightened his broad shoulders and asked angrily if my lord had really gone deaf, on top of everything else. He urged the Marquis on, and he frowned, drawing his eyebrows together across the bridge of his nose, removing his tenacious fingers from the girl's wrist. The Archduke noticed that the wounds on Syria's hand, covered with a medical bandage, had reopened bleeding wounds, promising that they would call the priest and he would help her. And the blue-eyed girl nodded and squeezed her wrist. Pressing his palm to his chest, Marquis Callus declared to his lordship that he could take the girl to the priest himself. Rush looked the young man up and down without a shred of enthusiasm and asked why the Marquis would do this. He swallowed quietly, trying to withstand the onslaught of all the contempt that oozed from the Archduke, and said that he simply had not finished speaking with the girl yet. The man turned his head to his wife and said that he would leave the choice entirely to his mistress. With a look that did not bode well for Callus, Rush repeated that Syria was always free to choose who would accompany her. Only after hearing these words, the blue-eyed girl gently touched the Archduke's elbow and strong hand with her fingers, turning half-turned towards him, and the young man froze in shock, looking at this. The blue-eyed woman smiled tenderly, raising her sparkling gaze to her husband, and said that she was indebted to his lordship for everything he had done. Rush gently put his arm around her shoulders and led her forward down the corridor, smiling as he asked if such words were unnecessary between spouses. Callus was left standing alone in the middle of the corridor when the Archduke ordered his assistant Lenin to invite a priest into their chambers. The priest examined the girl and said that the lady should temporarily refrain from any active movements, and then bowed and left the room. After watching the man leave, Rush turned his gaze to his wife, asking if she was feeling better. When the blue-eyed woman continued to sit and silently look at his face, the man folded his arms across his chest and asked if she was going to answer the question. Syria suddenly stood up from her seat and bowed to him, saying that she was a little late, but asked permission to thank his lordship for saving her. The fair-haired man jumped up excitedly and asked why the girl did this and whether she hit her head, and she quickly replied that she was completely fine with that. He asked in confusion what was the matter then, looking at Sterna's face, and the blue-eyed girl laughed a little, saying that she had only just now finally come to her senses. She understood that she owed her life to the main character for saving her, although she considered him the most terrible person in the world, and thanked him again. Rush froze in surprise, his bright red eyes wide as Syria, that same Syria, said that she was truly grateful to him. Thinking about how Archduke Girax had held his first wedding with her simply to keep her from dying, the blue-eyed one whispered that she would do anything to repay him for his kindness. With her head down, she asked him not to worry too much and said that she would try not to undermine his prospects for future marriage. Rush asked again to clarify whether he had heard her correctly, and the girl resolutely answered in the affirmative. The man, propping up his fist, said that it was the first time he had heard of a woman being concerned about such a question, and Syria said that even if he married 2, 3, or more times, he would still not stop inflaming women's hearts. He asked with a grin if she thought he was a libertine, and the girl quickly shook her head, but the blonde man suddenly smiled, asking if she was sure of that answer. A little at a loss, the blue-eyed woman said that she hoped that he would not be offended by the words that she intended to spend all her stern powers for the good of his domains for as long as their marriage lasted. Rush asked, a little confused, why she was watching his reaction so closely and whether he scared her, and the girl, laughing nervously, replied that she wouldn't say that. Mentally laughing at her behavior, the Archduke said that in any case, he would look forward to his wife's contribution to the well-being of the House of Berk. Smiling brightly at his trust and words, Syria assured him that she would do everything in her power to live up to his expectations. Much later, the girl descended into the cool dungeon that served as a prison and found her accompanying knight, Abigail. Syria approached the cell and touched the iron bars, and the dark-haired woman asked the lady how she knew about her location, but she said that it was not important at all now. Blue Eyes asked the knight what had made her challenge Callus's fighters, since it was considered disrespectful, and the girl muttered that she had only offered them a duel. Syria exhaled loudly and rubbed her forehead when Ebby stated that she had already had to clench all her patience into a fist in order to refrain from challenging the Marquis himself. The lady asked Abigail to do something about her character, and a cheerful male voice suddenly declared that she had not challenged them to a knightly duel, but rather to a fierce fight. Sir Eliot, always beaming with his smile and good mood, came down to them in the dungeon. He came closer and casually sang that Abigail could hardly escape the punishment of exile from the Empire. Pointing towards the knight, Eliot asked the lady not to worry, because thanks to the Archduke's mercy, the girl would be released in a couple of days, and the blue-eyed girl asked admiringly how she could repay him for such kindness. Eliot stated that Abigail was the only one in the master's debt, and Syria happily said that she was a knight and would definitely repay all debts, while the dark-haired one irritably asked how long they were going to stand there. When the young people came out of the dungeon onto the street, the Duchess wrapped her woolen poncho around herself, asking if it was too cold in the prison and if it was possible to freeze to death there. As if he had never thought about it before, Eliot asked if she seriously thought that was possible, and the blue-eyed girl muttered that she was worried about Abi. The fair-haired man assured her that she was one of those people who would find a way out, even if they ended up in a glacier, asking how the lady had managed to find such a hardy escort. Changing the subject, the blue-eyed girl suddenly declared that immediately after her release, Ebby would bring her hot beef soup and give her the best, thickest cloak she could find, and would also let her live in her chambers for a while. Eliot suddenly looked away and laughed, and Syria asked in confusion what was going on and what she had said. She froze in surprise and opened her mouth slightly when the head of the knight said with a smile that he seemed to understand what had interested the Archduke in her. The girl involuntarily remembered the warm hands of Rush, who hugged her, calmed her down, and said that such a death would be terribly unfair. Syria blushed brightly, thinking that such a man could actually find her even a little interesting. She was interrupted from her thoughts by a familiar voice of a man who said that he saw that the young people were enjoying their conversation. In front of them stood the Archduke's assistant, Lenin, who seemed overly tired and even somewhat exhausted. The lady immediately stepped towards him, noticing this state, and excitedly noticed that his face was completely gone. Lenin explained that his lordship had suddenly married, so it was necessary to obtain the approval of the imperial family, and he also asked to organize a reception in honor of his wife, but suddenly cleared his throat, adding that all this, of course, was trifles compared to the lady's work of checking the glacier. Syria felt incredibly awkward when the man said that she was still too weak to help him, and their marriage with the Archduke had not yet been approved, so he would have to do everything alone. However, the blue-eyed woman noticed from Lenin's face and behavior that he did not want to offend her with his words, and was worried that he might offend the Duchess. Placing her hand on her chest, the girl thanked the assistant with all her heart, thinking that the servants of the Berk house were much kinder than she could have imagined. Seeing her gentle mood, Lenin said that the end-of-the-year celebration would take place the day after tomorrow, and therefore she needed to start preparing, and the blue-eyed girl readily agreed. 2 days later, in the Archduke's palace, preparations for the celebration were in full swing in a variety of rooms. Begonia, who had finished putting up the girl's hair, enthusiastically said that the whole look looked amazing, and Syria even turned a little pink. She asked her dressmaker, embarrassed, if the lush, dark blue dress didn't look too pretentious, but she only straightened her mistress's hair, reminding her that she would soon become an archduchess, and therefore such a level of formality was acceptable. The girl quietly reminded Begonia that the gentleman had married her only to save her, but the woman warmly replied that she knew of cases in which gestures of goodwill had ultimately become fateful. Syria silently wondered if all this could really be fate, changed by her actions. The maid interrupted their conversation and entered the chambers, nervously saying that someone had come to see the mistress, but did not have time to finish. Saint Lena appeared behind her and shouted, brazenly calling Syria by name and asking her to talk. Begonia couldn't hold back, and irritably asked the brunette if she had really gone crazy to show up like that. The blue-eyed girl exhaled loudly, still sitting with her back to the door, and asked the dressmaker and the maid to leave them alone. Syria turned around, looking at the brunette, and said that she wanted to listen to her possible words. When the girls were alone, and the saint sat down on the sofa, close to the lady, she said that they were alone and could now talk calmly. Without looking at her interlocutor, Lena swallowed nervously and asked her not to blame Callus too much for what happened. The blue-eyed girl listened without much emotion on her face, as the brown-haired girl said that she herself had constantly pestered the Marquis with stories about how she wanted to go to the glacier, but they were suddenly caught in a snowstorm there. The girl coldly asked if the saint knew that Callus was her fiancé and that they were already engaged. Lowering her yellow eyes downwards, Lena cleared her throat and justified herself by saying that for her, he was just a dear friend, and she only wanted to create one last shared memory with him. The Duchess tapped her finger on her lips, echoing the strange words of the protagonist. Taking her hand away from her face, Syria pretended to be an interested woman, asking if she would now be more suitable for the Marquis if they now had this last memory. Lena opened her bright yellow eyes, tears gathering in the corners, and the girl thought that, unfortunately, he was bullying her just like in the book. The saint lowered her head, feeling hot tears scorching her cheeks, and then said that she simply wanted to befriend the lady. Covering her face with her hand, the blue-eyed woman exhaled loudly and asked if she really thought that an ex-wife and a current wife could become friends. She stared in surprise at the brunette when she suddenly asked why this couldn't be. Lena explained that she and Callus were not officially married, and Syria calmly replied that it was their business, which from now on did not concern her. The girl put her hands forward and expressed hope that they and the Wrights would be able to get closer, but they were interrupted by the maid, who informed the mistress that it was time for the event. Blue-eyed was glad to be able to avoid this awkward conversation and rose from her chair, trying to calm down. Lena suddenly asked whether Syria's mother was a commoner who later became an artist, and she froze, her eyes wide with fear. Meanwhile, Lennon asked his master that, if his memory served him right, the Duchess had fainted at her wedding after suffering severe blood loss, and he responded in the affirmative. Remembering all the girl's impulses to do everything without his help, or at least assistance, the assistant exclaimed, wondering why the man then did not forbid her to overwork herself. Looking at his papers, Rush said that he could not interfere with a person who sincerely wanted to work. Besides, it was better for the girl to be busy than to give in to empty thoughts. He looked up from his reading and glanced at his assistant to see why he was suddenly concerned about Syria's well-being, but the man was taken aback by the question. Lennon said with great zeal that he is not indifferent to those who quickly and efficiently perform their direct duties. He folded his arms across his chest and asked the gentleman if he knew how soon they had prepared for the year's celebration, and then declared that it was only thanks to the lady that he could sit here and leisurely look through the documents an hour before the ball. The assistant turned to the table and picked up the sheets of paper from it, asking if he would allow him to ask what had fascinated him so much. Lennon read that Archduke Berk would invite a mage from the kingdom of Nesla to exorcise the demons of their Laurel estate, and then asked if this would be the last visit and if the gentleman would take Syria with him. Rush stood up and placed his palms on the table, believing that he had to do this, because even though their union was temporary, they were still husband and wife. The assistant said that he would eagerly await the story of how the demons would behave when they saw the lady, and the Archduke, stepping forward, replied that he himself was interested in this. Turning around, the fair-haired man said that the feast would soon begin, and it would be heartless of him not to accompany his newly made wife there. Rush was walking calmly through the corridors of the castle when he suddenly bumped into Marquis Callus, immediately frowning and asking what he was doing here. The young man, who looked gloomy and restless as never before, confidently approached the Archduke, almost right up to him. When he said that he had simply come for St. Lena, his interlocutor asked why she was there and was told that Hannet himself did not know. The The Marquis suddenly seemed to straighten his shoulders even more, trying to appear impressive, and asked directly when the Archduke was going to dissolve his marriage. Rush looked at him with a frankly angry look of bright red eyes and knitted his eyebrows together, asking the young man what he meant. Extending his hand forward, Callus said that he was deeply grateful to the Duke for saving Syria's life and would repay him in full on behalf of House Hanet. His interlocutor coldly replied that all these speeches were astonishing, but asked why the Marquis would pay the debts of a completely strange wife, and he, amazed, appealed to his lordship. Rush folded his arms across his chest, asking the young man if there was still something connecting them. Clenching his fists, Callus declared that he was serious about divorcing Lena as soon as possible. Stepping forward, he said that, moreover, his marriage to Syria had already been officially approved by her father, Marquis Keladin. The Archduke's face darkened when Hanet asked if he had written a letter to the Syria family to ask their opinion on the matter. The man thought that all this was absurd, because he entered into this marriage to save the girl and could not have time to settle all the official aspects. Looking at the displeased face of his interlocutor, Rush mentally growled that everything that had happened was entirely his fault, and now he dared to boast about it. Realizing that he did not wish to waste any more time on either stupid conversations or the Marquis, the Archduke turned around and said that for a man who had put his bride's life at risk, he was too talkative. Suddenly, both men heard someone scream several times and call out loudly for Mrs. Syria. A few minutes ago, in the living room, Saint Lena asked the Duchess about her mother's origins. Everything the brunette said was true, because despite all her mother's beauty, she still remained an ordinary low-grade artist. The girl remembered that in the book, this woman was mentioned only a few times, but the original Syria reacted to this with madness and violence and became like a mad bull. Continuing to chat incessantly, the brunette declared that she liked the blue-eyed girl's parents even despite their origin. While a bright anger was slowly but surely seething inside the Duchess, the saint raised her fists as if in a victory gesture and said that they were all alike. The girl suddenly fell silent, seeing Syria's furious face, and opened her lips, asking why she was looking at her like that. The lady suddenly flew up to Lena, and furiously scorching her with her wide blue eyes, swung her palm. The brunette closed her eyes and seemed to shrink, expecting a very strong and even dangerous blow, but it did not follow, and she opened her eyes wide. Sterna came to her senses just in time, reminding herself of the whole situation, and hit herself, leaving a bright red mark on her cheek.